We're now moving into slicing our backlog so we can actually identify what we want to deliver. And there are multiple ways to do this, as there is in any agile practice. And again, we're probably going to be shouting ourselves hoarse by saying the same thing repeatedly. But what we are going to show you is a couple of techniques that have worked for us. So it all starts with asking the right questions and framing them in the right manner. I'll show you an example. Would you want to ask your clients, hey, what do you think are the easiest things for us to do? If you did that, what you're going to be focusing on mostly is focusing on what's feasible, as against also the stuff that is valuable, usable, desirable, or viable. Instead, what you want to do is focus on a slice across all of these attributes. And so how you frame your questions is incredibly critical. And we'll show you an example of how to do that in a bit. We've already talked to you about story maps, and Richa can talk about, how story maps can help you get to that first slice that's going to be eventually valuable, not just for your users, but also for the business that you're serving. Richa, do you want to take it from here?
So, like we said, we want to talk about, desirability, usability, valuability, and feasibility. As you remember, we already arranged the cards in a sequential manner and a critical manner, and in the order of criticality previously while making a story map. And we already remember that the topmost part, like the goals and activities, actually form our backbone. Right. So while prioritizing, I think one of the ways to do that is, or if there are stakeholders who are prioritizing with, or even for yourself, ask what is my walking skeleton? What stories can I do so that I can just create like bare bones walking skeleton? And then I can add the skin later, the clothes later, and then the makeup later. But my first aim is, hey, can I just create my walking skeleton across the backbone, right? Another way to ask a question is, hey, what is the quickest way for the user to complete a journey? So how quickly can a user go from point A to point B? And trust me, this, in my experiences, has worked like magic. Like I have been in a situation where if I've asked this question to the stakeholders and okay, let's try and do this, right? The stakeholders immediately go like, it seems like we wear like two different hats, right? The stakeholders are always going like, okay, it becomes like a game for them, or a challenge for them, that they need to go to the end point as in the least number of steps possible. So I've been in a situation where they've said, hey, we don't need this, we don't need this, we just need that. And then I've been in a situation where I'm like, no, to do this step, we definitely need to do this task. Like, if this page does not exist, then you can't have a certain story. I think that's a very healthy way of having conversations and arriving to what your thinnest slice actually is, right? So that is one way of asking the story. Another example that I often give is, let's say you were building an airline, like a website from where you can book air tickets, right? So there are various steps. You have to first enter the source, destination, how much luggage you're carrying, how many people you're going with. Then you have to select your seat, then you have to add your meal preferences, you have to see if you have extra luggage or not, and then you have to pay and so on. But there is a significant number of, there are a significant number of users who are single travelers on flight, who don't care about their meal preferences or their seat preferences. They're not a frequent traveler, right? And they don't have any extra luggage. So if you were to build something just for a single traveler, it would be very quick. It may not be the best way to market your website, because a lot of airlines today do that. But if you were just validating your end-to-end working, at least the end-to-end journey does complete for a single user, and you can take feedback in production from these users.
Yeah, and it provides something valuable, at least for a group of people, right?
Exactly.
Which in this case is not an insignificant group.
Absolutely. Right. So yeah, I mean, like giving those examples help, and like I stressed before, gamifying the process, it helps immensely, right? So if you kind of create like a game, like a challenge with the stakeholders in your team, hey, our aim is to go from here to here in like as quickly as possible. You could think of like further ways of gamifying the entire process. That helps.
Yeah.
Another.
I mean, we've got multiple techniques, right? So we call it buy a feature. That's a game that you play where you give everyone a certain amount of money, and then there is a cost placed on each feature, and they decide how they're going to be spending that money to be able to then figure out what the scope of your first slice could look like.
Absolutely. Right. Also, one quick checkpoint that I have done in the past is that if you're doing the first slice for the first time, and if you had 100 stories in your backlog, uh, your first slice should always be less than 25%. There is no science behind it. This is just a way I like to check, because if 75% of your backlog is already in your first slice, then you're doing something wrong, right? Like you're not using story maps, you're not prioritizing well. There is something wrong somewhere. Like you can't possibly say that 75% of my entire backlog has to be done before I go live, right? So if you've asked the right questions, if you've prioritized well, if you've indeed figured out the shortest path, this is like a rule that I like to follow, but it could be different for different people.
Yeah, there's a quote by the founder of LinkedIn which says that if you're not embarrassed by the first version of your product, then you've launched too late. And I think the 25% rule, and you can even make it the 10% rule, it just means that you're not getting real working software in front of your users quickly enough to get quick feedback. And that just is too late. Um, One thing I wanted to add to everything that Richard was saying, and we've discussed this offline, is that there is a very common way of prioritizing, which we call Moscow, which is must have, should have, could have, and would have. Uh, and there's a reason why we haven't expressed that as one of the preferred methods of prioritization. It works with people who are stakeholders who are actually very, very proficient in prioritization. And in those cases, if that works for them, great, go ahead. Go ahead and use Moscow for all practical purposes. But if your stakeholders aren't experienced, using some of the techniques that we've talked about, either gamification or choosing the shortest path, or forcing your stakeholders to choose a thin slice, the thinnest slice that gives them feedback quickly, I think those techniques are going to work much better.
Yeah, absolutely.
So just coming to the close of the video, we have a bunch of prioritization techniques that we've linked through in the course materials, and they will be in the description of this video as well. So take a look at that. And this is probably the only video in this segment. And if so, Richa, anything to add before we move to the next video? Okay, next video then.